Waddesdon Manor, documentary script. Winter fog crawls across the Buckinghamshire hills at 5 in the morning. The air smells like wet limestone and old money. Through the mist, something impossible appears. A French chateau, complete with towers and turrets, rising from English farmland like a hallucination made of stone. The windows catch the first light. Inside, chandeliers hang above empty rooms. The silence is absolute. This is Waddesdon Manor, built between 1874 and 1889 by Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, a man who spent the equivalent of £161 million in today's currency to construct a palace he never intended to fill with children, laughter, or warmth. The official story calls it a masterpiece of French Renaissance architecture. The unofficial story is written in the bones of workers whose names appear nowhere in the guest books, whose blood mixed with the mortar, whose deaths were never recorded in Ferdinand's meticulously kept accounts. Here's the question nobody asks during the guided tours. Was Waddesdon Manor built to celebrate life, or to bury grief so deep that even a banking fortune couldn't dig it back out? The story doesn't start in Buckinghamshire. It starts in Frankfurt 1836, where Ferdinand James de Rothschild was born into a family that didn't just have wealth, they were wealth. The Rothschilds financed wars, toppled currencies, and decided which governments would survive and which would collapse. By the time Ferdinand was old enough to understand what his last name meant, his family controlled more capital than most European nations. But money, as Ferdinand would learn, doesn't negotiate with death. December 1866, London. Ferdinand's young wife, Evelina, goes into labour. She's 27 years old. They've been married 18 months. The doctors arrive. The midwives wait. Hours pass, then more hours. Somewhere in that townhouse, surrounded by the finest physicians money could summon, Evelina de Rothschild dies in childbirth. The baby, a son, is stillborn. Ferdinand is 27. He will never marry again. What came next changed everything. Ferdinand didn't retreat into London society. He didn't bury himself in the family banking operations in Paris or Vienna. He bought 2,700 acres of Buckinghamshire farmland and announced he would build a chateau. Not an English country house, a chateau. French, ornate, impossible. A building that would make no architectural sense in the English countryside, which was precisely the point. Grief doesn't follow logic. It follows obsession. The site he chose was called Lodge Hill, a barren plateau with nothing on it but wind and clay soil. No water supply, no access roads suitable for heavy construction, no infrastructure whatsoever, just a hill that happened to offer views across the Vale of Aylesbury. To build on that hill, Ferdinand would first have to reshape it entirely. Between 1874 and 1877, workers removed 9 meters of topsoil from the summit, leveling the peak and creating terraces that would support the mansion's weight. 9 meters. That's roughly 3 stories of earth, all of it excavated by hand, loaded into carts, and hauled away by men whose names Ferdinand never bothered to record. But moving dirt was just the beginning. There was no railway nearby, so Ferdinand built one, a dedicated tramway 3.5 miles long, connecting the construction site to the Quainton Road station. Steam locomotives hauled limestone from Bath, marble from Italy, timber from the Baltic, and glass from Belgium up that private rail line. The tramway operated for over a decade, carrying thousands of tons of material. When construction finished, Ferdinand had the tracks torn up. The route still exists as footpaths and farm roads. Locals call sections of it the Baron's Way. The locomotives were sold off. Nobody thought to record how many men died laying that track or operating those trains. The architectural plans came from a Frenchman named Gabriel Hippolyte Destailleur, who specialized in designing chateaux for clients who wanted to pretend they were living in the Loire Valley regardless of geography. Destailleur looked at Ferdinand's barren hilltop and saw an opportunity to recreate Blois, Chambord, Maintenon, and a dozen other royal residences all at once. He drew up plans for a mansion with 70 rooms, towers copied directly from French Renaissance originals, external staircases that had no functional purpose except to look impressive, and enough decorative stonework to employ a small army of sculptors for years. Destailleur had made a career of selling fantasies of legitimacy to nouveau riche industrialists and bankers. Ferdinand was different. He had old money, yet still wanted to build this imitation. The drawings were meticulous, every detail specified to the millimeter. The French Renaissance style had rules, and breaking them would expose the building as fake. The contradiction was intentional. Ferdinand wanted the impossibility to be obvious, wanted to announce that he operated by different rules. From the moment construction began, locals complained. Critics called it ostentatious. Ferdinand had impeccable taste and was using perfect execution to flaunt wealth in a culture that preferred the wealthy to pretend they weren't trying. Ferdinand approved everything. Cost was irrelevant. The contractor was a firm called Conde and Company, but the real work fell to hundreds of labourers whose identities are lost. We know from construction records that the project employed bricklayers, stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, plasterers, painters, and general labourers. We know they worked 6 days a week, year-round, through English winters. We know some of them lived in temporary barracks on the estate. What we don't know is how many fell from scaffolding, how many crushed their hands moving stone blocks, how many developed lung disease from stone dust, or how many simply died from exhaustion or infection and were buried in unmarked graves in local churchyards. The work was punishing. Victorian construction sites operated without safety regulations, insurance, or worker protections. If you fell, you fell. If stone crushed your foot, you lost the foot and probably your job. A stonemason at Waddesdon would arrive before dawn, walking from Aylesbury or surrounding villages. He brought his own tools, paid for replacements from his wages. Work lasted until dusk, 12 to 14-hour days in summer, less in winter when mortar froze. The job was to shape Bath limestone into blocks matching Destailleur's specifications within 2 millimeters. Any more variance meant no pay for that day's work. The dust was constant, getting in eyes, nose, lungs. Silicosis was common among stonemasons. Most who developed it were dead within 5 years. Wages for a skilled stonemason ranged from 25 to 35 shillings per week, roughly $528 to $740 per year in current value. Not starvation wages, but barely enough. Most went to rent and food. Missing a week due to injury meant the family went hungry. There was no sick pay, no disability compensation, no safety net. Below the skilled trades were general labourers, earning half as much for work just as dangerous. They moved stone blocks weighing hundreds of pounds, dug foundations through clay, mixed mortar until their arms went numb. They operated lifting machines on platforms 30 feet high with no railings, no harnesses, no protection. Historians estimate 2 to 5 deaths per 1,000 workers per year on large Victorian construction projects. Waddesdon employed roughly 300 workers at peak. Over 15 years, that suggests 9 to 23 deaths directly attributable to the project. Their names don't appear in Ferdinand's records. The architectural madness had a method. Every detail was imported. The exterior stonework was Bath limestone, cut and shaped by masons who had to match their work to Destailleur's drawings within millimeters. The roof was covered in tiles manufactured in France and shipped to England. The chimneys were designed to evoke the skyline of Chambord, which meant nothing to the men who built them but everything to Ferdinand, who wanted his house to look like it belonged to dead French kings. Inside, the construction became even more complex. Ferdinand wanted Waddesdon to showcase his art collection, which meant the interior had to function as a museum, disguised as a residence. The ceilings were coffered and painted. The walls were panelled in oak and hung with silk. The floors were parquet, each room a different pattern, all laid by craftsmen who spent months on their knees fitting thousands of individual pieces of wood together. Ferdinand imported entire rooms from demolished French palaces. Fireplaces that once warmed aristocrats before the Revolution were torn out, crated, shipped to England, and reassembled at Waddesdon. The main staircase was modelled after the one at the Château de Maison. The salons were designed to display Sèvres porcelain and Beauvais tapestries. Every element screamed expense. The construction budget was $382,000, which translates to approximately $161 million in current value. That figure covers only the building itself, not the furnishings, not the landscaping, not the infrastructure. Ferdinand's actual expenditure ran far higher, but he didn't publish detailed accounts. The Rothschilds didn't explain their spending to anyone. While the mansion rose, Ferdinand turned his attention to the grounds. The barren hilltop needed to become a French formal garden, which meant importing not just plants but entire landscapes. He hired a French landscape architect named Élie Lenné, who had worked on the imperial gardens for Napoleon III. Lenné arrived in Buckinghamshire and found himself facing an agricultural plateau with heavy clay soil and no natural water features. He proposed a solution: bring the water to the garden. Ferdinand agreed. Workers dug reservoirs, laid miles of underground pipe, and created a hydraulic system that pumped water up the hill from springs in the valley below. The fountains and ornamental pools at Waddesdon consume thousands of gallons daily, all of it hauled uphill by machines installed in the 1870s and still partially operational today. The gardens required trees, thousands of them. Ferdinand wanted mature specimens, not saplings. His estate manager, a man named George Johnson, organized the transplantation of fully grown trees from nurseries across England and France. Moving a mature tree in the Victorian era was an engineering feat. Workers dug enormous root balls, wrapped them in burlap, loaded them onto wagons, hauled them to Waddesdon, and replanted them using winches and ramps. Johnson's diary, one of the few worker accounts that survived, mentions moving oaks that took 16 horses to pull. He doesn't mention how many men it took to dig the holes, or how many trees died in the process, or what happened to the labourers who injured themselves during the work. The tree moving alone employed dozens of men for years, backbreaking labour that left no monument except the trees themselves, which tourists now photograph without knowing their history. By 1881, the basic structure was complete. But Ferdinand kept building. He added conservatories filled with tropical plants that required constant heating. He built stables for 30 horses. He constructed a laundry facility large enough to service a small hotel. He installed a gasworks to provide lighting, then ripped it all out 5 years later when electricity became fashionable. In 1890, Queen Victoria announced she would visit Waddesdon. Ferdinand immediately hired engineers to wire the entire mansion for electric lights, making Waddesdon one of the first private residences in England with full electrical service. The project took months. Crews ran cables through walls, installed generators in the basement, and placed light fixtures in every room. The Queen spent 3 hours at Waddesdon during her visit. Ferdinand kept the electrical system. Behind the scenes, the estate required an army to function. The 1891 census, taken 2 years after construction officially ended, lists 41 people living and working at Waddesdon Manor. 24 were indoor servants: the house steward, the butler, the groom of the chambers, 2 valets, 8 housemaids, 3 kitchen maids, a scullery maid, a still-room maid, 2 laundry maids, a seamstress, and an electric light attendant. whose sole job was to maintain the new electrical system. 17 more worked outdoors: grooms, stable boys, gardeners, and gatekeepers. Those are just the live-in staff. Day labourers, seasonal workers, and contractors weren't counted. They lived in nearby villages, walked to Waddesdon before dawn, worked 12-hour shifts and walked home in the dark. The servants lived in quarters designed to keep them invisible. Back staircases allowed maids to move between floors without being seen by guests. The kitchen was located in the basement, far from the dining rooms, connected by a dumbwaiter system that delivered meals, while keeping cooking smells and servant noise out of Ferdinand's carefully curated spaces. The staff bedrooms were small, unheated, and sparsely furnished. The contrast was absolute. Downstairs, Ferdinand displayed furniture that belonged to Marie Antoinette. Upstairs, his housemaids slept on iron cots. The architecture of invisibility was deliberate. Victorian upper-class life depended on servants who performed essential but shameful labor. The solution was architectural: design the house so servants could work without being noticed. Waddesdon had separate entrances, corridors, and staircases for staff. They could move through the entire building, carrying coal, emptying chamber pots, delivering meals, without ever crossing paths with Ferdinand or his guests. The system required precise choreography. Servants had schedules dictating when they could be in which rooms. The servant hierarchy was rigid and ruthlessly enforced. At the top, the house steward, managing indoor staff, earning 80 taskishels to $100 per year. Below him, the butler at 50 thalers to 60s, then footman at 20 to 30. The female hierarchy paralleled: housekeeper, ladies' maids, then housemaids, kitchen maids, scullery maids, laundry maids. At the bottom, a scullery maid earned $12 to $15 per year, barely enough to survive, even with room and board provided. The gender wage gap was explicit. A male footman earned nearly double what a female housemaid earned for arguably harder work. The workday for a housemaid began at 5 in the morning. First, light fires in reception rooms so they'd be warm when Ferdinand or guests came downstairs. This meant carrying coal from the basement, kneeling on cold floors, cleaning ashes, laying new fires. Waddesdon had 70 rooms and at least 20 fireplaces in regular use. After fires came bedroom service: silently enter guest bedrooms while guests slept, empty chamber pots, replace water, lay out towels. Then breakfast, then cleaning that never ended: dusting, sweeping, polishing, washing windows, beating carpets, scrubbing floors. A housemaid might finish work at 10 or 11 at night, 6 hours of sleep before starting again at 5. The physical toll was immense. Chronic back problems, joint pain, varicose veins, respiratory issues from smoke and chemicals. Tuberculosis spread through cramped servants' quarters. Industrial accidents, burns, cuts, falls, no workers' compensation. The psychological toll might have been worse. Servants lived in constant subordination. They couldn't speak unless spoken to, couldn't make eye contact, couldn't express opinions, almost no privacy. The housekeeper inspected their rooms. Their correspondence was sometimes monitored. Relationships between servants were forbidden. If two were caught together, both were fired. What nobody mentions in the guidebooks is what happened when they got old or sick. Victorian domestic service offered no pensions, no health care, no retirement plans. When a maid's hands became too arthritic to polish silver or a groom's back gave out, they were let go. Some found other positions, some returned to families, some ended up in workhouses. Parish records around Waddesdon show multiple former domestic servants admitted to the Aylesbury workhouse in the 1890s and early 1900s. Some probably worked at Waddesdon. They disappeared into the workhouse system and died there, buried in paupers' graves, their service unacknowledged. Ferdinand filled his chateau with objects. His shopping spree through European auction houses and dealers lasted decades. He bought an entire room of 18th-century French panelling from the Hôtel de Crillon in Paris. He acquired a writing desk that supposedly belonged to Jean-Henri Reisener, the master cabinet maker to Louis XVI. He collected Sèvres porcelain until he owned one of the largest private collections in Britain, over 1,000 pieces. He bought Beauvais tapestries, Savonnerie carpets, and Venetian paintings. He purchased armor, manuscripts, and snuff boxes. Every acquisition was catalogued, insured, and displayed. The total value of Ferdinand's collection by the time of his death exceeded 2 million, roughly 850 million today. None of it generated income. It just sat there, depreciating and requiring constant maintenance. The collecting had its own logic, or its own pathology. Ferdinand wasn't buying art because he needed it. He was buying it because he could, because accumulation was what people with infinite resources did, because filling rooms with expensive objects was proof that he existed, and the grief hadn't completely consumed him. Art dealers loved him. He paid asking price without haggling. He bought entire estates worth of furniture sight unseen. He outbid museums without hesitation. His reputation was such that when significant French decorative art came to market, dealers contacted Ferdinand first. What made it more surreal was that most objects had provenance. They weren't replicas, they were the actual furniture and porcelain French aristocrats had owned before the Revolution. When Ferdinand bought Marie Antoinette's table, he was buying a table she had actually used. Some items had been seized during the Terror, sold off to pay revolutionary debts, and circulated through European markets for a century before landing at Waddesdon. Ferdinand was essentially collecting the material remains of a destroyed social order and recreating their original context in England. He was resurrecting, by purchasing power, a world that had been violently overthrown because its inequality became intolerable. The conservation requirements alone were staggering. Ferdinand employed a full-time conservator just for the porcelain. Tapestries needed quarterly inspections and annual cleaning. Climate control, security, insurance, specialized maintenance for French 18th century furniture with hand-cut joinery and hide glue, all wildly expensive. The math was brutal, $15,000 per year to maintain Waddesdon in the 1890s, equivalent to 6 tools, $3 million today. The estate generated almost no income. Ferdinand hemorrhaged $12,000 to $13,000 per year in net losses every year. Over 30 years, that's $360,000 to $390,000, or $152 million to $165 million in current value. Add the initial $382,000 construction cost and over $2 million in art acquisitions. Total expenditure probably exceeded $3 million, roughly $27 billion today. What did he get? A house he barely lived in, filled with objects he rarely used, surrounded by gardens he occasionally walked through. The chateau was more symbol than residence. It proved that Ferdinand de Rothschild could build something utterly impractical and sustain it indefinitely. The financial mathematics of Waddesdon never worked. Maintaining the estate cost approximately $15,000 per year in the 1890s, equivalent to about $6, $3 million today. That figure includes staff salaries, repairs, heating, lighting, and grounds maintenance. The estate generated almost no revenue. Ferdinand wasn't farming the land commercially. He wasn't renting out rooms. Waddesdon existed solely to house his art collection and host weekend parties for fellow aristocrats. The only reason the place didn't bankrupt him was that Ferdinand's share of the Rothschild banking fortune was essentially infinite. He could hemorrhage money forever and never notice. But behind the financial abstraction were real costs. The coal to heat Waddesdon's 70 rooms came from Welsh mines where children worked underground. The gas for the lights came from refineries where workers breathed toxic fumes. The marble came from Italian quarries where men died in rockfalls. The silk for the wall coverings came from factories where young women ruined their eyesight in dim light. The porcelain came from kilns where temperatures reached levels that caused frequent burns and fires. Ferdinand never visited those mines, refineries, quarries, factories or kilns. He just signed the checks and accepted delivery. The guest lists tell their own story. Ferdinand hosted the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, multiple times. The Shah of Persia visited. European aristocrats came for shooting parties, where they would slaughter hundreds of pheasants in a single afternoon, while servants loaded their guns and collected the bodies. Politicians came to discuss policy over cigars and brandy in rooms lined with priceless art. Ferdinand threw elaborate dinners where the menus were printed in French and the wine selection could cost more than a labourer earned in a year. The guests marvelled at the house and praised Ferdinand's taste. Nobody asked about the men who built it. The shooting parties deserve particular attention. They were Waddesdon's primary social function. Ferdinand would invite 20 or 30 guests for a weekend. They'd arrive Friday evening, shoot Saturday and Sunday, and leave Monday morning. The kills were staggering. A single day's shooting could produce 300 to 500 dead pheasants. The birds were bred specifically for this purpose, raised in pens, released into the woods, and driven toward the guns by beaters who walked through the underbrush making noise. The aristocrats stood in designated spots and shot birds out of the sky. The birds fell, retrievers collected them, servants counted them. The numbers were recorded in game books as proof of prowess. It was slaughter disguised as sport, and it was the glue that held Victorian aristocratic society together. Men who might otherwise have nothing in common bonded over killing birds. Historians sometimes describe Ferdinand as a generous employer. There's limited evidence for this. He paid market wages, which in Victorian England meant subsistence wages. He didn't tolerate unions or collective bargaining. When servants requested time off or better conditions, they were replaced. The generosity narrative seems to stem from the fact that Ferdinand didn't actively brutalize his workers, which was apparently noteworthy by aristocratic standards of the era. The bar was low. What Ferdinand did memorialize was his wife. Evelina's presence haunts Waddesdon in subtle ways. Ferdinand never turned her rooms into museums or shrines, which would have been typical Victorian mourning behaviour. Instead, he seems to have built the entire house as an oblique monument to what he lost. The absence of children, the lack of family life, the transformation of a home into a display case for objects. Waddesdon was never meant to be lived in. It was meant to be perfect, unchanging, and ultimately empty, just like Ferdinand's life after December 1866. Victorian mourning had elaborate rituals. Widowers were expected to wear mourning clothes, observe social withdrawal, and eventually remarry. Ferdinand followed some conventions and ignored others. He never remarried, which was unusual for a man of his wealth and position. The Rothschild dynasty needed heirs, but his branch would end with him. He seemed to accept this. No second wife meant no comparison to Evelina. No children meant no reminder of the child he lost. Grief became his identity. Psychologists today might call it complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder. Persistent yearning for the deceased, difficulty accepting the death, avoiding reminders while being preoccupied with the loss, a sense that life is meaningless without them. Ferdinand displayed all of these. He couldn't talk about Evelina, so he erased her from the record by destroying his papers. He avoided creating a new family, so he built a chateau instead. He filled it with objects from dead people, surrounding himself with beautiful things that couldn't leave him. Instead of processing the loss emotionally, he processed it materially. He converted pain into projects. Waddesdon gave Ferdinand something to control. When everything else had failed, the doctors, the wealth, the Rothschild name, he could at least control his house. Every detail was specified. Every purchase was deliberate. The house became an expression of order imposed on chaos, permanence achieved in defiance of mortality. The logic doesn't hold up, but grief doesn't require logical consistency. His social life revolved around entertaining, but the entertaining was performative. Ferdinand collected people the way he collected porcelain. Guests would arrive, admire the house, eat elaborate meals, and leave. There's no record of deep friendships or intimate relationships. His correspondence, what survives of it, is formal and detached. He travelled constantly between London, Paris, and the continent, but always returned to Waddesdon. The house became both his masterpiece and his prison. There's a photograph of Ferdinand from the 1890s taken at Waddesdon. He's standing in one of the salons, surrounded by his art collection, wearing formal attire, looking directly at the camera. His expression is neutral. Not happy, not sad, not anything. Just present. The photograph captures a man who seems disconnected from his surroundings, despite owning them. The opulence around him means nothing. Behind the neutral expression is a void that all the Sèvres porcelain in the world couldn't fill. On December 17, 1898, Ferdinand died at Waddesdon Manor on his 59th birthday. The official cause was heart failure. He left specific instructions that all his personal papers, diaries, and private correspondence were to be destroyed immediately after his death. His executors complied. Whatever Ferdinand thought, felt, or regretted during those final decades went into the fire. We have his financial records, his art catalogues, and his architectural drawings. We don't have his interior life. The estate passed to his sister, Alice de Rothschild, who was just as obsessed with the house as Ferdinand had been. Alice expanded the collections, hired more staff, and maintained Waddesdon exactly as Ferdinand left it. She lived there until her death in 1922, never marrying, never having children, preserving her brother's monument with religious devotion. After Alice died, the house went to her nephew James de Rothschild, who finally began to treat Waddesdon as something other than a shrine. James actually used the place. He and his wife Dorothy lived at Waddesdon, raised their children there, and tried to make it functional. But the Great Depression and 2 world wars made maintaining a 70-room chateau increasingly absurd. Staff became harder to find and more expensive to keep. The art collection required constant conservation. The building needed endless repairs. The gardens demanded year-round labor. By the 1930s, Waddesdon was draining the Rothschild fortune at an unsustainable rate. World War II changed everything. In 1940, with Nazi Germany advancing across Europe, the British government began evacuating children from London. James de Rothschild offered Waddesdon as a refuge. For the next 5 years, children from Croydon lived in the chateau, sleeping in bedrooms meant for aristocrats, playing in gardens designed for royal visitors, and attending makeshift schools in rooms filled with priceless art. Photographs from this period show kids sitting on Marie Antoinette's furniture, doing homework under Sèvres chandeliers. It was the first time Waddesdon ever functioned as a home for children, 60 years after Ferdinand began construction. The transformation was jarring. Waddesdon had been designed as a child-free zone, a place of adult sophistication and aesthetic contemplation. Now it was overrun with kids who didn't care about provenance or historical significance. They played tag in the grand salons. They tracked mud onto the parquet floors. They touched everything. For the first time in its history, the house was loud, chaotic, and alive. The children came from working-class families in Croydon, an industrial borough south of London heavily targeted during the Blitz. Their homes were being bombed, their schools were destroyed. Some had lost family members. The Rothschilds converted bedrooms into dormitories, set up a school in the billiard room, turned conservatories into play areas. For the children, Waddesdon must have seemed like a fantasy. They came from cramped terrace houses in a smoky city. Now they were living in a French chateau with towers and fountains. Some had never seen countryside before. The war forced a reckoning with class that Waddesdon's existence had been designed to avoid. Suddenly, working-class children were inhabiting a space built to exclude them. They were touching objects worth more than their parents would earn in a lifetime. They saw the servants' quarters, the back staircases, the infrastructure that made luxury possible. The facade cracked. There's a deeper irony here. Ferdinand built Waddesdon because his own child died. For 60 years, the house stood as a monument to a child who never lived. Then the war brought children to Waddesdon, dozens of them, and the house finally served the function Ferdinand had denied it. It became a place where children grew up, not his children, not Rothschild children, children from Croydon, whose families worked in factories and shops. The house that was built to memorialize grief became, however briefly, a place that protected life. For 5 years, Waddesdon did something genuinely useful. That's more than it did during Ferdinand's entire lifetime. The children left in 1945. James and Dorothy returned to find the house worn and damaged. Restoring Waddesdon to its pre-war condition would cost a fortune, but keeping it maintained afterward would cost even more. James faced a choice: pour money into a building that served no practical purpose, or let it go. He chose to let it go. In 1957, he donated Waddesdon Manor to the National Trust with an endowment to cover maintenance. The Rothschild family retained some involvement, but the house was no longer theirs. It became public property. Since 1959, Waddesdon has operated as a museum. Nearly 500,000 people visit annually, walking through rooms that Ferdinand designed, but that now belong to everyone and no one. They photograph the chandeliers, admire the Sèvres collection, and learn about 18th-century French furniture. The National Trust trained guides lead tours, explaining the architectural references and the provenance of the art. What they don't explain, because the information doesn't exist, is where the construction workers are buried. The transformation from private residence to public museum required extensive adaptation, visitor infrastructure, ticket offices, restrooms, gift shops, cafes, circulation routes for thousands without damaging fragile furnishings. The commercial model today is sophisticated: basic admission, special exhibitions, corporate events, private rentals. The gift shop sells reproductions and Waddesdon-branded merchandise. The restaurant serves afternoon tea at prices that would make a Victorian scullery maid weep. The wine cellar sells bottles for $50, $100, $200. Everything is commodified. The National Trust's interpretation has evolved. Early tours focused exclusively on art and architecture, treating Waddesdon as a treasure house. More recent materials acknowledge the labor history, the class dynamics, the problematic nature of aristocratic wealth. But the acknowledgement is minimal and carefully calibrated. The National Trust can't alienate its core audience, which includes people who visit country houses precisely because they romanticize aristocratic life. So the messaging is balanced. Yes, inequality existed, but look at these beautiful tapestries. The critique is present but muted. What's missing is systemic analysis. Tours discuss individual servants, but not domestic service as an institution. They mention construction workers, but not Victorian labour conditions. They present Ferdinand as a grieving widower, not as a member of a banking dynasty whose wealth derived from global capital flows. The narrative is personalized, emotionally accessible but analytically shallow. The churchyards around Waddesdon hold hundreds of graves from the 1870s and 1880s. Most are marked with simple stones: a name, dates, nothing more. Some list occupations: labourer, mason, carpenter. Some don't have names, just unknown man or initials. Parish records mention deaths from falls, crushing injuries, fevers, but rarely specify where the person worked. There's one grave that stands out, Thomas Williams, died 1878, aged 34, stonemason. Williams died during peak construction. It's possible he worked on Waddesdon. The parish record lists fever. We'll never know if he contributed, but his grave stands as a proxy for all the workers whose resting places are unmarked. Modern Waddesdon employs around 200 people with market wages, benefits, regulated conditions. The contrast with Ferdinand's era is absolute. Current staff have names, contracts, labour protections. They go home to their own houses. Progress is real, but it came too late for the people who built the place. The tour guides navigate difficult terrain. The best ones acknowledge the tension openly. This house is beautiful and troubling. We're preserving important art, but also a record of extreme inequality. The workers deserve to be remembered as much as the man who paid for it. The National Trust has done extensive conservation work on Waddesdon, spending millions to preserve the building and collections. Every repair reveals more about the original construction. Conservators have found builders' marks, graffiti scratched into hidden surfaces, and initials carved into roof beams. J.B. 1879, T.W. 1882. Small rebellions by workers who knew their names would never appear in the official history, but left them anyway, hidden where only future restorers would find them. The financial model today is completely different from Ferdinand's era. Waddesdon generates revenue through ticket sales, events, and a commercial partnership with the Rothschild Foundation. The house pays for itself, more or less, which is something it never did when the Rothschilds owned it privately. Visitors contribute to the preservation. The irony is that Waddesdon is more financially sustainable as a public museum than it ever was as a private residence, because museums don't require 70 rooms to be heated year-round or 40 servants to maintain standards that nobody sees. The gardens still operate on Ferdinand's hydraulic system, upgraded but fundamentally unchanged. Water still pumps uphill to feed the fountains and pools. The mature trees that George Johnson transplanted in the 1870s still stand, some of them now over 150 years old. The estate's ecological footprint remains massive. Waddesdon consumes energy, water and resources at levels that would make modern environmentalists wince, but it's considered acceptable because it's heritage. We preserve what rich people built, regardless of the cost. What gets lost in all the preservation and celebration is the central question. What was it for? Ferdinand built Waddesdon to house objects and entertain guests. The objects are now in glass cases, and the guests pay admission. The house serves the same function it always did, just with a different ownership structure. It's still a monument to wealth, still a display of what unlimited money can buy, still proof that the rich can shape reality to match their fantasies. The only thing that changed is who benefits from the fantasy. Some argue that Waddesdon represents the pinnacle of craftsmanship, that it preserved artisan skills that would have otherwise died out, that it stands as testimony to what human beings can achieve when resources aren't a constraint. There's truth in that. The stonework, the woodwork, the decorative arts on display at Waddesdon are genuinely extraordinary. The level of skill required to create those objects and that building was immense. But skill in service of what? Skill applied to making a man's grief into architecture, to filling rooms that nobody lived in, to creating beauty that only a select few could access. The craftsmanship was real, but the purpose was hollow. Others argue that places like Waddesdon are cautionary tales, monuments to excess and inequality. Also true, every object in that house represents labor extracted and wages paid. Every room is evidence of a system where some people had so much money they literally didn't know what to do with it, while others worked themselves to death for subsistence pay. The fact that we now preserve these places and charge admission creates a strange feedback loop where inequality becomes heritage and exploitation becomes art. We're not just remembering history, we're commodifying it, selling tickets to walk through monuments to systems most people claim to reject. The question of what to do with buildings like Waddesdon has no clean answer. Letting them decay feels like erasing history. Maintaining them requires enormous resources that could potentially be used elsewhere. Celebrating them risks romanticizing the systems that created them. The National Trust tries to thread this needle by presenting Waddesdon as both beautiful and problematic, by acknowledging the labor that built it, while also recognizing its architectural significance. Whether they succeed is debatable. The workers still appear as footnotes in a story told primarily through the lens of the Rothschilds, their architecture and their collections. What's certain is that the people who paid the real price for Waddesdon, the workers whose bodies and lives went into its construction, are mostly forgotten. We have comprehensive records of Ferdinand's art purchases and guest lists. We have photographs of every room and documentation of every renovation. We have Ferdinand's will, his financial statements, and his architectural correspondence. What we don't have are the names, stories, or families of the hundreds of men who built the place. They existed to serve the project, and once the project was complete, they disappeared from the record. This isn't unique to Waddesdon. Every palace, chateau, manor house, and monument from this era has the same gap in its history. The builders are nameless. The craftsmen are anonymous. The servants are statistics. Historians call this the problem of the archive. Records were kept for people who mattered, and working-class people didn't matter to the people keeping records. Reconstructing their lives requires detective work, cross-referencing census data, parish records, newspaper accounts, and archaeological evidence. It's labor-intensive and incomplete. Most of the time we end up with fragments, a name, a date, an occupation, a cause of death. Never the full story. Waddesdon is beautiful, that's undeniable. The architecture is stunning, the collections are world-class, and the gardens are extraordinary. People who visit come away impressed and moved. Beauty has value, art has value, preservation has value. But beauty built on invisible suffering carries weight that shouldn't be ignored. Every time we celebrate these places without acknowledging the human cost, we participate in the same erasure that happened during construction. We admire the product while forgetting the process. The French Renaissance revival at Waddesdon was always an illusion. Those chateaux Ferdinand copied were built by absolute monarchs who commanded resources through feudal power. Ferdinand built his chateau using capital, which is a different kind of power but produces similar results. Money replaced divine right, but the outcome was the same. One man's vision realized through the labor of hundreds, creating something that would outlast them all while erasing their contribution. Some of the workers who built Waddesdon probably took pride in the work. Craftsmen generally do. Creating something beautiful and lasting has intrinsic satisfaction, even when you don't own it, and even when the compensation is inadequate. It's possible some of those stonemasons looked at the finished building and felt genuine pride, but pride doesn't pay rent. Satisfaction doesn't feed families. Legacy doesn't matter when you're dead from silicosis at 40 because you spent 15 years breathing stone dust. There's a visitor's book at Waddesdon where people write comments after their tours. Most entries are effusive, stunning, breathtaking, a must-see. Some are more analytical, incredible craftsmanship, fascinating history. Very few mention the workers. Once in a while someone writes beautiful but built on the backs of the poor. The guides don't comment. The National Trust doesn't respond. The entry just sits there in the book, a small disruption in the narrative of heritage and preservation. What would Waddesdon look like if the workers had been given authorship? If instead of Ferdinand de Rothschild's chateau, it was marketed as the collective achievement of the hundreds who built it? If the plaques listed the stonemasons alongside the architects, the carpenters alongside the designers? If tours began not with Ferdinand's biography, but with the social conditions of 1870s construction labor, the building would be the same, the art would be the same, but the story would shift. Instead of a tale of one man's grief and taste, it would become a story of collective labor, class exploitation, and the human cost of grandeur. That version of Waddesdon doesn't exist. The version that exists is Ferdinand's version, because Ferdinand had the money to write the story, and the workers didn't. That's how legacy works. Those with resources shape the narrative. Those without resources get edited out. The archive preserves what the powerful want preserved and discards the rest. The National Trust is not Ferdinand de Rothschild. They're a modern organization operating under different values and constraints. They can't retroactively create records that were never made. They can't name workers whose names were never recorded. What they can do, and what they're starting to do, is acknowledge the gap. Recent interpretive materials at Waddesdon include references to the construction labor and the servant workforce. It's a start, but it's minimal. The fundamental narrative remains focused on the Rothschilds, the architecture, and the collections. The workers are footnotes. If you visit Waddesdon today, you can walk through rooms where Ferdinand never slept, look at art he never enjoyed, and admire craftsmanship he barely noticed. You can stand in the gardens and imagine the effort required to move those mature trees up that hill. You can tour the service quarters and see where the maids lived. The National Trust has preserved the physical evidence. What's missing is the human dimension, the voices of the people who made it all possible. They're there in the gaps, in the silences, in the spaces between the documented facts. You just have to look. The math of Waddesdon is brutal. $382,000 for construction, another $2 million for furnishings, $15,000 per year in operating costs. All of it paid by a fortune built on capital flows, on lending money to governments and profiting from interest, on transactions that created wealth without producing goods, and all of it made real by the physical labor of people who earned weekly wages and lived in rented rooms. The ratio of wealth to labor was so asymmetrical, it's almost incomprehensible. Ferdinand could spend in one afternoon what a mason earned in a lifetime. The system wasn't secret, it wasn't hidden. It was just accepted. What survives is the building, the art, the gardens, the legacy as defined by those who had the power to define it. What doesn't survive are the individual stories of the workers who made it possible. We know they existed. We know they suffered. We know some of them died. We know their labor created something that outlasted them. That's all we know. The rest is silence. Waddesdon Manor stands on its hill in Buckinghamshire, still imposing, still beautiful, still visited by hundreds of thousands every year. The National Trust maintains it. Scholars study it. Tourists photograph it. It generates revenue, employs people, and preserves a particular kind of history. Whether that history is worth preserving is a question each visitor has to answer for themselves. The building makes the case for its own significance just by existing. But existence isn't argument. Survival isn't justification. Waddesdon endures because it's too expensive to demolish and too beautiful to ignore, which is perhaps the most honest explanation available. Ferdinand de Rothschild never explained why he built Waddesdon. He had the power to destroy his own papers, to erase his motivations, to leave us with the structure but not the reasoning. Was it grief, ambition, boredom, dynastic pride, all of the above? None of the above? We can speculate, but we can't know. What we do know is that building it required mobilizing vast resources and hundreds of workers to transform a barren hilltop into a French fantasy. We know the fantasy succeeded. We know the cost was borne by people whose names we'll never learn. The workers who built Waddesdon are buried somewhere, in churchyards around Aylesbury and Quainton and the surrounding villages, under stones that say labourer or just dates or nothing at all. Some probably died old, in beds, surrounded by family. Some probably died young from accidents or disease or the accumulated damage of years of hard labour. Some left children who inherited their poverty. Some left nothing. The earth took them back, and the earth kept their secrets. Waddesdon Manor doesn't keep secrets. Everything is documented, catalogued and displayed. You can see Ferdinand's purchases, you can read his correspondence with architects, you can examine the floor plans and the receipts. What you can't see is what happened in the unmarked spaces, the conversations that were never written down, the decisions made by people who had no choice, the suffering that left no record. History preserves what is written. Silence preserves nothing. So here's what remains. A beautiful building, filled with beautiful objects, surrounded by beautiful gardens, all of it made possible by a banking fortune and the labour of the forgotten. Visitors walk through and feel awe. That's appropriate. The craftsmanship deserves awe. The scale deserves awe. What also deserves recognition is the human cost, the lives spent, the names lost, the stories never told. Waddesdon is both a masterpiece and a monument to inequality. It can be both things simultaneously. Recognizing that doesn't diminish the beauty. It just makes the beauty more complicated. On winter mornings, when the fog rolls in and the house emerges from the mist like something from another century, it still looks impossible. A French chateau in the English countryside, built by a grieving baron who died without children, maintained by invisible servants, filled with objects that belonged to guillotined royalty, now preserved as heritage and open to crowds who pay admission to walk through rooms that were never meant for them. The whole enterprise was absurd from the start. It remains absurd. But it's the kind of absurdity that human beings keep building in different forms, across different centuries, because some people have the resources to make the impossible real, and other people have no choice but to make it happen. The question the National Trust won't ask during the guided tour is the same question Ferdinand never answered. Who really paid for Waddesdon Manor? The Rothschilds signed the cheques. The workers bled in the foundations. Both statements are true. Only one made it into the official history. That imbalance is Waddesdon's real legacy, not the architecture or the art, but the gap between what we celebrate and what we forget. The house will stand for another century, probably longer. The workers' names will stay lost. That's how these stories always end, unless someone decides to tell it differently.